Boldwood presents The Family at Number 12. Written by Anita Waller and read by Marie Lawrence. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Sometimes I know part of me is still a ghost, walking next to my mother, looking for something to make an offering to, holding her hand. Either this feeling means that part of me is dead, or that she's alive, somewhere inside of me. Therese Marie Mailhot, Heartberries. However motherhood comes to you, it's a miracle. Valerie Harper. Book 1. A House with No Books. May 1998 to January 2012. Chapter 1. Jeanette Gregson always felt scared. Everything she did, most of what she saw or experienced, filled her with fear. Even going upstairs to the toilet made her worry that she might fall back down the narrow, twisty stairs and hurt herself, and be lying there for days with nobody to assist her. Her fear of the dark was helped by leaving the light on all night, a small lamp on her bedside table, serving as her comfort blanket, until the night that the light bulb popped and went out. Now she had a light bulb in the lamp, and 2 spare ones in the bedside table drawer. She had managed to pass her driving test, although she knew she would never understand how the driving examiner couldn't see how terrified she was. The buses, as they pulled alongside her tiny car, made her flinch. Traffic lights at amber made her tremble as she had to make decisions as to whether to go or stop, and zebra crossings with people waiting to cross caused her heart palpitations as she imagined her foot slipping as they got halfway across and mowing them all down. Fear. She hated this out-of-control feeling and blamed her mother for dying and leaving her to cope alone. Cancer. The biggest fear of all. And her mother, the formidable Barbara Gregson, had been forced to tell her that she only had 6 months left when the inoperable tumour caused her stomach to reach massive proportions. But Jeanette would be taken care of because the house was paid for, and there was nobody else entitled to a share of it. Cancer. Fear. Panic that the stomach would explode and splatter her with blood and gore. Instead, Mother had simply faded away. Nothing had exploded. She had merely died. Jeanette had a job, of sorts. With the money from her mother's savings account, she became a dog carer. This, she decided, would save her having to go physically to work, be it either in an office or a shop, and she would only have to talk to the very minimum number of people. She'd had the concept of a small run of kennels in the back garden, where she would house dogs for holiday periods, when owners weren't able to take their much-loved animals with them, and she had built the little dog houses herself. To have somebody come into her home to do work for any length of time was unthinkable. Jeanette taught herself basic woodworking skills by getting books from the library. She coped with a gas or electric meter read, but nothing else. Jeanette was simply terrified of life. She spoke only when she had to, with the exception of when quiz programs were on television, and then she took pride in answering the questions, trying desperately to beat the mastermind contestants. University Challenge was a bit more of a brain-hurting half hour, but she enjoyed watching the struggles as the teams tried to work out the answers. Neighbours on both sides of her house had given up trying to converse with her, and she was truly grateful for that. At 24 years of age, she had reached the decision that she simply didn't like people. She liked dogs. She enjoyed the seclusion of being on her own and knew she wouldn't want her mother back to be part of her life again. She was happy when she was alone. The neighbours knew better than to complain about the occasional noisy barking of some unhappy animal who was missing his human parents, because she solved all problems by simply not answering the door. Even the milkman had devised a 4-part knock so that she knew it was him calling to collect his weekly payment for the milk delivered to her doorstep. So, the day the man rang and asked if he could call to have a look at her kennels before committing to leaving his Cavalier King Charles Spaniel with her for a week was a worry. But everything was a worry. And when he arrived, on time and smartly dressed, she led him around the side of the house and to the back garden where the shelters were. He inspected them closely and agreed she had an excellent setup. He liked the heaters she had installed for cold nights, and he was impressed by the leaflet she handed him with details of fees. "That will be okay. I'll be bringing Bessie in 3 weeks, if that's okay." "That's fine. I will require a deposit to secure a place." "How much?" His eyes suddenly seemed hooded when he spoke. £50. Her voice was firm. She could do this. Could take his money and then make herself a cup of tea to calm down. "You can give me a receipt?" "Of course. Please, follow me." There was a tiny conservatory her mother had built leading off the kitchen, which she had made into her office, and she took him there, to the desk, where she kept all her paperwork. She pulled out the receipt book and felt a push on her back, which catapulted her towards the kitchen door. It burst open, propelling her through to the kitchen, the momentum taking her down onto the floor. Shock hit her, and she tried to roll over, but the man landed on top of her, his weight pinning her fragile frame underneath him with ease. "Shut up," he said, and dragged at her jeans. She tried to fight, and he lifted her head, smashing it onto the tiles. Her vision darkened, and she remembered nothing more. When her brain began to surface, he had his trousers around his ankles. He had flipped her over, removed all her clothes, and was raping her. She froze at the sheer horror of it, then saw the cast-iron cobbler's foot that had been the kitchen doorstop for as many years as she had lived there. She felt him ejaculate into her with a groan and collapse onto her, almost squashing the breath from her lungs. But she squirmed away, reached the cobbler's foot and swung it around, connecting with his head. She hit him 3 times with it until he had no movement left in him. Jeanette was sobbing as she extricated herself from the motionless body on top of her, and she ran for the stairs, naked, trembling, and crying. The pain between her legs was almost unbearable, and she began to run a bath after locking the bathroom door behind her. While the water was filling up the tub, she swallowed 3 paracetamol tablets and prayed they would begin to work quickly. She stayed in the bath for over an hour, scrubbing herself furiously to get rid of the stickiness, the smell, all caused by the man she hoped had now left her home. She tried to clean around the large bite mark on her right breast, but that was a pain too far, and she dabbed gingerly at it several times. Her skin felt raw as she wrapped a towel around her before putting on her dressing gown, and she sat down initially on the toilet seat, then slumped on the floor as she tried to find a comfortable, less painful way of sitting. She remained there for 3 hours before venturing to open the bathroom door. The pain had lessened, but she was sore, and she stepped cautiously down the stairs, listening for anything, any sounds from anywhere in her house. It was eerily silent, and she offered up a prayer of thanks that he seemed to have gone. She hadn't even got his name, only the name of his bloody dog, and she wasn't convinced he even had any sort of animal. He was the animal. The police? She trembled at the thought. No, she couldn't do that. She couldn't allow them into her home, her life. She had watched enough crime programs on television to tell her what it would be like reporting a rape. It would be fobbed off as all her fault. She must have led the man on. She was probably wearing the wrong clothes. No police. She stopped and sat on the bottom stair, listening. Still no sounds. Glancing at the clock in the hall, she saw it was almost 5 o'clock. Surely he would have gathered himself together and disappeared by now? She would lock the conservatory doors, lock the kitchen door, and soothe herself out of the blue funk she was currently in. And she would cancel all bookings for the dogs she hadn't taken before. She would only take previously kennelled animals. She felt as if she was retaking control of her life, sitting there on the stairs. But she wasn't retaking it to the extent that she wanted to move and do the actual locking of doors, face the carnage of the kitchen where it all happened, clean up any blood. Her own head had bled from when he had banged it on the floor to knock her out, so there must be bloodstains. She felt comfortable on the stairs, in the enclosed and tidy hallway, away from the horror of her kitchen. Her position on the bottom stair had allowed her to sit on one buttock, ease the pain inside her vagina. She wanted to stay there forever. When the clock reached 6, she knew that wasn't possible. She needed to heal herself, to heal the frantic workings of her brain, and that would begin with swallowing a couple of painkillers, removing her dressing gown and the towel, and replacing them with proper clothes, taking control back. Yes, she was scared, but she couldn't sit on the bottom stair forever. She had 2 dogs in the kennels who needed feeding, and they had to be seen to, no matter what. She slowly eased herself to a standing position, wincing at the sharp pain inside her, and tentatively stepped down onto the hall floor. Pausing at the lounge door, she listened, but being convinced she couldn't hear anything, she slowly opened it, peering around the room. It looked exactly the same as it had always looked, simply furnished with only 2 armchairs, a small coffee table, and a television on a stand. Her mother's sideboard held items that rarely saw the light of day, and had a lamp on top, which was the only lighting ever used in this room. Now, she switched on the large central ceiling globe. She needed the dark to go. She crossed to the curtains and pulled them back to let sunshine flood in. She normally kept them almost closed, as she knew sunshine faded carpets and other fabrics. But now, she needed the light, not the darkness. He hadn't been in there. She would have felt him. She hoped this meant he had picked himself up when he'd come round from the battering and simply disappeared. Her mind switched to thinking about security-proofing her garden. No more would she admit random visitors. It would be by appointment only. She would insist on names before they came, and she would damn well have to recognise those names as previous clients, or she would tell them she was fully booked. The dining room was equally free of his presence, and she sat on one of the dining chairs, relieved that he hadn't contaminated her favourite room. This was where she sat when she wanted to draw. The table contained a small pile of items she used: pencils, rubbers, 3 drawing books, a 12-inch tall posable wooden figure. It would have been too much to bear if he had entered this room, bringing evil into it. She pulled her large drawing book towards her, opened it, and stroked the paper. It soothed her. It didn't stop her pain, but it soothed her. She looked at the half-drawn figure of a child sitting on a swing that was sending her high into the heavens, and remembered the day in the park with her mother, when the world was good for both of them. The heights she had screamingly reached as the swing went higher and higher. She hadn't quite caught that delicious feeling yet in the drawing, but it would come. She knew it would. She closed the pad and stood. Time to face the kitchen. To feed the dogs, then lock her doors. Tomorrow she would begin her recovery, but tonight she had to face the scene currently causing her so much distress. The door was slightly open, just as she had left it as she had run headlong for the stairs. She pushed it open the rest of the way. Chapter 2. She could smell blood. Smell it before she saw it. She felt herself begin to gag, felt the vomit rise from her stomach, but it wasn't as a result of the strange aroma. It was the sight of the man, still on her kitchen floor, still unconscious. Fear, indecision, terror all battled inside her head for supremacy. She turned her back on the scene, swallowed convulsively and returned to the hall, closing the kitchen door behind her. "Think," she said aloud, almost as if she didn't trust her thoughts on their own to give her the right answer. "Think. Get dressed before he comes round properly." She took her own advice and walked slowly towards the stairs, aware of pain and soreness with every step. She climbed, again with caution, reached her bedroom and left her thoughts switched off. She couldn't deal with him until she had sorted out some clean clothes. She put on 5 pairs of pants in the hope they would cushion some of the pain, added a clean pad to soak up any blood still left to flow out of her, then jeans. A bra and t-shirt soon followed, and she decided she would put on the bright yellow Crocs she normally wore for cleaning out the kennels. They could be washed in the washing machine. The biggest problem was that they were in the conservatory, and he was blocking the door through from the kitchen to that room. She returned to the hallway, feeling more secure now she had shed the towel and dressing gown. But she knew she needed those Crocs. She put on her slippers, went through the front door and round the side of the house to the back garden. Jeanette stepped into the conservatory and swapped her slippers for the Crocs. Only then did she glance at the open kitchen door. His eyes were wide, staring. She fixed her focus on his chest and realised there was no movement. All movement had stopped in her mother's chest when she had breathed her last. The 2 dogs in the kennels began to bark, as if to tell her it was walk time and feeding time. She hurriedly grabbed food from her store in the conservatory and ran outside to stop them barking. She tipped food into their bowls, checked their water, and spoke soothingly to them to calm them down. While she was looking after them, she wasn't having to deal with a dead body. With the dogs happily eating and the gates to the dog run opened, she left them and walked back to the conservatory, where she lowered all the blinds. She didn't know if the neighbours could see into her house, but she didn't want to take the chance. There was a lot of blood. She tried to edge around it, but the yellow Crocs soon became tinged with a thick, deep red gunge. She filled a jug with water, walked back to him, and poured the liquid over his face. "He's dead," she confirmed to herself. "If he wasn't, he'd have moved. So, what do I do now?" What she decided not to do was involve the police. After careful consideration, she realised there was no proof he had been there that afternoon. She hadn't got around to entering his name in her bookings diary, hadn't even asked him his name. So, she fetched a large piece of plastic sheeting that, in an earlier life, had been wrapped around bundles of wood used for making the kennels. She had saved it, in case she ever needed it, and she really needed it now. At only 5 feet in height, and very slim in stature, Jeanette wasn't the strongest person on the planet. So, she began by tying her long dark hair into a ponytail, wincing as the hair tugged on the lump created by him smacking her head onto the tiled floor. She cleaned as much of the blood as possible from around the huge bulk of the man lying on her kitchen floor, and carefully probed into his inside pocket, removing his wallet. His credit card confirmed his name as Philip Hancock, and she slipped the wallet into a kitchen drawer. She knew she would have to deal with it later, but currently, she had a much bigger problem. The 16 stones or so of man lying on her floor. She shuddered with horror as she thought of him on top of her, forcing himself into her, hurting her, bruising her, until it was almost too painful to move. She placed an old duster over his eyes. She couldn't bear him to keep staring at her, then picked up the cobbler's foot and placed it in a bucket, checking that every part of it was submerged in cold water and bleach. Hadn't her mother always told her that bleach only worked effectively in cold water? She returned to her final task and stood for a moment, gathering her strength for the next part. He didn't look half so scary with an old yellow duster covering his eyes, but he still looked just as heavy. Before attempting to roll him, She headed to the point halfway down the hall where the door to the cellar was. She unlocked it and left it wide open. The rich, earthy smell of the coal remnants still down there flooded out, and she sniffed appreciatively. She had always loved the slight chemical smell of the cellar, but her fear of steps kept her firmly grounded at the top of this particular flight, and she knew once he was down there, she could continue to live her life. No police, and her own pain from the attack would go. She fetched a cushion from the lounge and used it to wedge the cellar door open, then went back to the kitchen. She smoothed out the plastic sheet, then braced herself against a kitchen unit and attempted to move him by leaning against the unit and using her yellow croc feet to roll him over and into position on the sheet. She had already placed long pieces of garden twine under the plastic and secured him inside the wrapping with them, in a very clumsy fashion. In all, it took her 90 minutes, and when she was finished she felt exhausted. This wasn't how she lived her life. She would never have dreamed of doing something so extraordinarily stupid as killing someone. But here she was, a murderer. And she still hadn't got this trussed-up turkey-like thing out of the kitchen. Jeanette opened the door of her mother's sideboard and took out the dark blue bottle of sherry, so loved by Barbara. She poured herself a large tumbler of it, reflecting it was the first time the bottle had been opened for a number of years, but she needed something. She also had a further 2 painkillers, as she realised she would really be hurting by the time she'd finished doing what she had to do. Sitting for half an hour and letting the alcohol and painkillers do their work gave Jeanette time to recover and to think through the rest of her actions. She blessed the Victorians who had built her house, blessed them for the solid walls, the addition of solid locks on every door in the place, and knew she could get him into that cellar, turn the key, and nobody would ever stumble across him. Not now, not in the future. And when she herself died, they would probably find him, whoever bought the house, but she would be gone anyway. Her thoughts drifted towards leaving some sort of journal detailing what had happened and sealing it into an envelope with the man's wallet. But her eyes were closing, and she had to shake herself awake, push herself to get up and complete the work. She wedged the kitchen door open with the vacuum cleaner and moved up to what she was desperately trying to think of as a turkey and grabbed at the head. She tugged, she pulled, and it was only by going to the foot end that she made any significant movement. Pushing seemed to work better while in the kitchen, but once she actually had him in the hall, it seemed easier to pull him. Deciding to take a rest from such physical back-breaking work, she left him for a bit and walked back into the kitchen. There were still spots of blood to clean now the body had been moved, so she filled the mop bucket and began to restore her domain to its previous pristine condition. The smell of bleach was almost overpowering, but she felt cleansed. It was as she was rinsing the water down the sink that she heard a noise, in the conservatory. She spun around as the noise was followed by a knock on the kitchen door. "Jeanette, you there?" She cautiously opened the door. "Oh, Mr. Earnshaw. I'm sorry. I was just washing the floor." "No problem. We came home a day early, so I thought I'd pop round and collect Daisy. Are you okay? You look very pale." "I'm fine, thanks. I'll just get Daisy's lead, and you can take her. She's been fed." She stepped into the conservatory, closing the kitchen door behind her. Handing the lead to Ian Earnshaw, Jeanette followed him down to the kennels. She watched him and Daisy, bouncing around like a puppy, walk away, her breath expelling from her in short, sharp bursts as she battled to keep control of her senses. If he'd come an hour earlier. That side gate had to be kept locked. It wasn't good that anybody could just arrive at her back door. She would see to it as soon as she felt well enough. The body inside the plastic was almost at the cellar door, and she locked every possible means of access to her property before carrying on with what she was now beginning to think of as her punishment for battering him with the cobbler's foot. She tugged, pulled, and got him half onto the small square space, the cellar head. She felt a little flummoxed by her next move, because he was almost bent in two, but there was a stiffness creeping into the body now, and she knew rigor mortis was well on its way, making handling him so much harder. She leaned her back against the door jamb and pushed with her feet. Slowly, inch by inch, he began to slide, and suddenly to fall. She increased the pressure, pushed harder, and the large plastic bundle began to almost fold itself onto the steep cellar steps. She gave one last enormous push, and he slid, the plastic helping the descent. Jeanette leaned over, unable to stop the vomit, unable to stop the shaking. She collapsed onto the ragged linoleum of the cellar head, and finally, tears came. She hugged herself tightly, wiped her mouth, and looked down the steps. He had landed at an awkward angle, but that was it. His awkward angle for the rest of eternity, as far as she was concerned. Had she saved other women from going through what she had gone through? She suspected yes, but she didn't really want to know. She wanted a cup of tea, a chat with her mother's ashes, and maybe she would bring in the one remaining dog for an hour in the lounge tonight. No more dogs were due for another week, so she would enjoy Candy for the rest of her stay, and then she could give that dog-free time over to recovery. She moved back out to the hallway, turned the large iron key in the lock, and slipped it into her jeans pocket. Tomorrow, she would finish cleaning up the cobbler's foot and place it back in its usual place, just in case. Chapter 3. 10 p.m. Tears. Jeanette's sobs became cataclysmic, and she grabbed for the paper bag that was always to hand for such moments as this. Panic attacks were a normal part of her life, a part she had learned to live with, but this one was bad. She breathed slowly in and out, concentrating on making her actions steady and smooth, aware of her mother's voice echoing through her head. Slowly, breathe deeply, Jeanette. You'll be fine in a minute. Except this time, it took 15 minutes for her heart rate to settle, her breathing to slow to something approaching normal, and she had to deliberately steer her mind away from the body jammed halfway down the cellar steps. She had another glass of sherry, emptying the last dregs from the deep blue bottle, and switched on the television to catch the last of the news. None of what she watched registered in her brain, and at 11 o'clock she gave in. Double-checked every door was locked and headed upstairs. At least he hadn't contaminated anywhere above ground level in her home. She hadn't had the courage or the inclination to venture into the kennels to seek the company of what must now be a very lonely dog. But that was tough. She simply hadn't had the mental strength. She ran her second bath of the evening, adding salt in the hope that it would help with the healing. She lay back and winced as the water touched the deep bite mark on her right breast. She knew it would make sense to use antibiotic cream on it, and that it would accelerate the healing, but it hurt so damn much at the moment. By midnight, she had taken further painkillers, smeared both breasts with the cream, and had put on her favourite nightie as she struggled to seek comfort from anywhere she could get it. She slept. Sunshine woke Jeanette, and she smiled. Then she stopped smiling, as memories of the previous day washed over her. She groaned as she swung her legs out of bed. There wasn't a part of her that didn't ache. She didn't wash, didn't brush her teeth, simply staggered downstairs in her nightie and dressing gown, stopped at the front door to collect the daily pint of milk from the step, then came to a halt as she reached the cellar door. She edged over to the left of the hallway and almost ran past it until she was at the kitchen. Her mind saw the body, but the smell of bleach still lingered, and her floor and work surfaces were spotlessly clean. After putting the milk bottle in the fridge, Jeanette cautiously opened the back door and breathed in the warm, fresh air, the sunshine dazzling her. Candy, the little Jack Russell, barked as she spotted her carer, and a half smile touched Jeanette's face. At least she had nothing to fear from a dog. She went down to the kennels put Candy's breakfast into her bowl and renewed her water. "We'll maybe go for a walk in an hour or so," she said to the little dog, who wagged her tail in agreement. She doubted if she would keep to that statement, but she knew that's what she would have done if she hadn't been brutally attacked the previous afternoon. Actions like that tended to change perspectives on normal routines. Despite a long, restful sleep, the pain was still there. Maybe a walk today wasn't the best idea she'd had. She opened the gate from the kennels to the run at the end of the garden, and knew Candy would find her own exercise. This particular little dog took great delight in running round and round in circles. A dog, because she looked after dogs of all breeds and sizes. She had resisted having one herself. It only now occurred to her that if she had had one yesterday, one who would protect its mistress, maybe things would have been a lot different, and possibly she wouldn't feel quite so alone. The 3 years without her mother had been an exceedingly long 3 years. She stayed for a few minutes longer, letting the sunshine warm her, comfort her, then turned and walked slowly back to the conservatory. She made a note in her diary that Daisy had been collected a day early, then closed the roll top on her bureau. This small action was something she always did as she retired for the night, but the previous night had been something of an exception to her routine. Today she wasn't expecting any clients, and Candy was with her for a couple of days yet, so, in theory, the bureau would remain closed. She stepped up from the conservatory into the kitchen and felt her stomach lurch. Was this going to happen every time she came into this particular room? She took deep breaths, wanting no repetition of the panic attack of the previous evening, then clicked on the kettle. A cup of tea. Her mother had always made her a cup of tea after any sort of meltdown, and that was what she needed right now. She popped a slice of bread into the toaster, and as soon as it was ready, she threw it straight into the bin. She couldn't eat. Not yet. The cup of tea was enough for the moment. Her stomach would tell her when it was ready to accept food again, she figured. Going back into the hall was hard. The cellar door was simply there, and while it might be solidly locked, she knew what lay behind it. She needed to do something before it drove her mad. A curtain. Mother had always insisted on a thick, full-length curtain against the front door, to keep out drafts, she had said. It was only when Jeanette had taken it down to wash it that she had realised she didn't like it. The front door looked much better without it, and the curtain had been consigned to the airing cupboard. She could put a curtain pole above the cellar door jamb and hide the whole damn thing. If she couldn't see the door, it wasn't there. Invigorated by positive thoughts and actions, and the sunshine, she headed back upstairs. This time she only stayed in her salt bath for half an hour, then dressed and returned to the kitchen, clutching the door curtain. She shook it out and carried it outdoors, hanging it on the washing line. It would be freshened by a couple of hours in the sunshine, and she could spend that time putting the pole above the cellar door, the one saved from the front door. She had to shorten the curtain by 6 inches, all of which helped to ease her mind. She would get over this. Mundane little jobs like hand sewing a hem would calm her. One day, she would be able to walk past the door curtain and not go into a breakdown. One day, she would forget his face, forget the hole in his head that she had excavated with her cobbler's foot. One day. Just not yet. While there was still pain, she couldn't forget. Her breasts hurt, particularly the one with the deeper bite mark. Inside her, the pain had become intermittent, which she hoped was part of the healing process, and not a deeper indication of something going wrong that might require medical intervention. She didn't do doctors. The very thought of attending a surgery or an accident and emergency department caused shivers to run up and down her spine, and she knew that wouldn't happen. Visiting her mother at the hospice in her last few days had been traumatic enough, and since her death, Jeanette hadn't ventured anywhere near anything vaguely medical. Having the curtain hanging in front of the cellar door changed everything. What was behind the door could now stay behind it, hidden forever. She removed the key from her jeans pocket and placed it on the Victorian door jamb, hiding it completely from view. She had no reason to think anybody would come looking for him. With hindsight, she had no reason to think he had a dog. He had come to her home with the intention of raping her, not booking his dog in for a holiday. Questions raced around her head. Had he followed her at some stage? Had he seen her walk back from the shops after she had put her card advertising her dog-sitting services in the newsagent's window and thought, what a pretty girl she was? Was that where he had gleaned her phone number from? Had he thought he could overpower her with no trouble? Because if he had thought that, then his thoughts were spot on. She had been overpowered, but what he had failed to realise was that possibly she might fight back with a cobbler's foot, a cast-iron 100-year-old cobbler's foot. She made herself another cup of tea, but still wanted nothing to eat. She wanted to sleep, to be wrapped in a warm, woolly throw that would surround her with comfort. Sleep on the sofa, in her cosy lounge that still bore traces of her late, lamented mother. It had always been the front room, one rarely used. Now she used it for her relaxing times, for times when stress faded away, when she had no worries about anything. She needed that again, that trouble-free time, and the front room gave that to her. She fed Candy and brought her into the house with her. An hour of company would benefit both of them, and she felt able to cope better with an animal for a companion. It would have been unthinkable on that first night of pain. Her entire concentration had been needed for herself. By 9 o'clock, Jeanette had turned off the television, made the decision to sleep downstairs on the sofa, locked all doors, and settled Candy onto a dog bed on the floor, by her side. She left the small lamp on, and sat for a while, drawing the little Jack Russell. She felt close to Candy. She didn't know why, but assumed it was because that's all she had had, her and the dog, on the most traumatic and difficult day of her life. The drawing was good. She captured the way the little dog tilted her head when she heard a quiet human voice, and took care to make sure her brown markings were perfectly positioned. "You're a good subject, Candy," she said and smiled properly. She handed the dog a treat, and Candy accepted it with a slight woof. She showed the picture to Candy, who looked at it with disdain, and placed her paw on Jeanette's knee. "You want more treats? Let's see what we can do." She placed a few on her palm and Candy took them with some speed. "Okay," Jeanette said. "Time to sleep. Come on. You need to wee if you're staying inside." She led her to the back door, her eyes roaming everywhere to make sure it was safe. Would she ever feel it was again? Candy disappeared, then a minute later was back by Jeanette's side. "Good girl," she said, and reached down to pat Candy's head. "Let's go and make a glass of hot milk, take a couple of painkillers and go to sleep. We'll be over the top with milk if I don't." Jeanette was aware she hadn't eaten for about 30 hours, and while the milk was heating, she pulled the biscuit barrel towards her. She glanced inside, then replaced the lid. "Nah," she said. "Don't want anything. Not yet, anyway. Let's get through tonight, Candy, and maybe I'll have something in the morning." The dog once again gave a gentle woof, and they walked together back into the lounge. Her comfort room, until she no longer needed a comfort room. Chapter 4. Jeanette woke at 4, pushing back from the nightmare that had almost taken hold of her. The body she had dragged from the kitchen was the other side of the cellar door, knocking on it, demanding to be let out. Thankful she had left the small light glowing, she sat up, pulled the blanket around her, and realised Candy had left her own bed and had climbed on the sofa to be with her. Pulling the little dog towards her, She sat staring into space while she waited for her brain to normalize itself. "Don't get used to this," she murmured. "You're back in your kennel tonight. I don't want to spoil you for your own home." Candy snuggled down and closed her eyes. Jeanette didn't. She didn't think she could trust going back to sleep. Not yet. The nightmare needed to go. Her mind needed to be at rest. She picked up the drawing pad and once again drew Candy. This time snuggled beside her. The little dog's eyes closed. It was a quick sketch and captured Candy perfectly. It brought a smile to Jeanette's face, and she turned over the page. "Draw it out of you," she murmured. "Draw the damn thing out of you." She closed her eyes for a moment and pictured her kitchen, then swiftly sketched the basic view of it, the cupboards, the table, the door through the hall, before adding herself to the floor, and him on top of her. It was a fast, 10-minute drawing, and she knew she had captured it, the horror of it. She began to shade and fill out the strokes already there, and it was only when she heard the quadruple knock on the front door that she put it to one side. Grabbing her dressing gown, she ran to the front door, picking up the money from the hall stand as she went. "I'm sorry," she gasped. "I'm running late today." The milkman smiled at her, surprised to see her still in her nightwear. She was usually dressed seeing to her dogs. "No problem. I'd have waited. You've not missed your weekly milk money for the last few years, so you're not going to start now, I'm sure," he said, and took the exact money from her before handing her the bottle he held in his hand. "Have a good week, Jeanette," he said, and left her standing there with yet another pint of milk. Maybe cornflakes for breakfast then, she decided. She closed the front door and locked it, then went to find Candy, who was standing with her front paws on the bay windowsill, staring out at the departing milkman. "Come on, Candy, let's go out the back and you can have a wee while I find us some breakfast." Candy was easily pleased with the dry dog food put down by Jeanette, followed by a small dish of milk. Jeanette stared at her equally small dish of cornflakes and wondered if it would stay down if she ate it. She managed 3 spoonfuls and decided it was enough. The rest she tipped into Candy's bowl. The dog seemed hardly able to believe her luck. It was only as Jeanette bent over to tip the extra treat into the bowl that she realised she had been able to sit at the table, on a hard wooden chair, without discomfort. Her sigh of relief was heartfelt. She decided to shower rather than sit in a bath, and walked into the bedroom, a spring in her step. She inspected the injury to her scalp and carefully brushed her wet hair to hide it. She needed to go shopping, and on such a warm day she could hardly wear a hat to hide the lump and the cut. She played with Candy in the garden for a while, then locked her in the pound before getting ready to go to the shops. She unlocked the front door, and 2 police officers stood there, one of them with a hand raised and about to knock. Jeanette froze. "Sorry, ma'am. Hope I didn't make you jump." His smile was infectious, and she gulped. "Not at all. My fault. I was miles away. I'm just nipping out to the shops." She knew she was waffling. He held a picture out to her. "Have you seen this man in the neighbourhood, or do you know him?" "Yes, he's dead in my cellar." She took the picture and stared at him. "No, I don't think so. Who is he?" "His name is Philip Hancock, and his wife has reported him missing. He hasn't been home for almost 3 days. We've located his car in this area, so we're going door to door to see if anyone has seen him." She stepped onto the front step and closed the door behind her. "Well, I go out very little, but I'll be sure to contact the police if I do see him. I do hope you find him alive and well." "Thank you, ma'am. We'll just tick you off our list. You shouldn't have anybody else call. Have a good day." They left her at the garden gate. She turned left, and they turned right. She forced herself to take deep breaths all the way to the shops, went into the small Tesco, spoke to no one, and was back home within half an hour. She put her shopping away, took 3 tablets from the new pack of paracetamol and went for a lie down on the bed. She slept a dreamless, nightmareless sleep for 3 hours, then woke in a panic as she realised the sun had dipped lower in the sky. Jeanette took Candy out for a walk, but saw no evidence of any further police activity. She had woken with good feelings and relief that most of the pain had gone, only to have her day ruined by the arrival of the 2 constables on her doorstep. She realised the issue wasn't going to go away, but surely the police wouldn't be granted search warrants for every home in the locality, just because he'd left his car there. What puzzled her more than anything was that she had a desire to know if he really did have a dog. If he didn't, it meant he had arrived with the intention of raping her. If he did, maybe the kenneling query had been overridden by thoughts of easy sex, once he'd spotted a pretty, slim female who was on her own and available. Except, she wasn't available. She had never so much as kissed a man, let alone had sex with one. She had to know why he had arrived in her back garden. It would almost be the worst thing if she found out he had no dog. That meant he had seen her at some point and found out what she did for a living, had tracked her down to her home, had invaded her space with the sole intention of forcing himself on her. Jeanette needed to know where he lived. She fastened Candy's lead, and they set off for the walk she had kept promising the little dog. The newsagent's shop was first on the list, and she bought the local daily paper, figuring there might be something in that. She hoped it wasn't too soon, but if it was, she would buy a paper every day until she got the information she wanted. The walk around the park, with Candy zooming in all directions on the lead extension, brought Jeanette almost back to a feeling of normality. The police hadn't been in the least suspicious. It had been a few seconds of, "Do you know this face?" and they had moved on. So, he had a wife, apparently. Why couldn't that woman have been enough for him? She felt so tempted to open the newspaper and begin to search through it, but resisted. She needed either her kitchen or her dining table, where she could spread it out and not miss even the tiniest column. Candy was approaching a much bigger dog, a Labrador, and Jeanette called her name, beginning to reel in the lead extension, drawing the little dog closer to where Jeanette was resting on a bench. Candy ran towards her and jumped up onto the seat, then onto Jeanette's lap to lick her face. Her breast bore the full weight of the little dog, and Jeanette gave a whimper of pain. The bites definitely needed more healing time, and she stood, Candy now walking sedately by her side. By the time they reached home, Jeanette had decided she would ring the local animal rescue centre, who she occasionally helped out with boarding strays if they became too full, and check out availability of any older ones waiting for rehoming. She knew she would feel safer with a permanent animal companion. She would make the dog a part of her home and her life, and they would grow together, and he or she would keep her safe. She made a hot drink, helped herself to a biscuit after taking Candy down to her kennel for a rest, and spread out the paper on the dining room table. She didn't turn any pages over until she had read every inch of the print. And then she saw it, a tiny version of the photograph the police had shown her. Philip Hancock, missing. Police would like to hear from anyone who had seen him. His wife, Teresa, age 34, of Meadow Drive, had reported him missing when he didn't return home after walking out on her as the result of an argument. The police, it stated, weren't overly concerned about his welfare at this stage, but would like to hear from him or from anyone who had seen him. No mention of a bloody dog. She cut out the small notification and placed it in her drawing book, now back in its rightful place on the dining table. She folded the paper, got out her street guide, and looked up Meadow Drive. Time to put this whole episode to bed. She could do that, Once she knew what had prompted the attack. Once she knew if he had planned to rape her anyway, or had simply taken advantage of the situation that had suddenly presented itself to him. Did he have a dog called Bessie, or didn't he, was what it really boiled down to. And she stuffed the newspaper in her kitchen bin. Tomorrow, early, she would take Candy in the car, travel to Meadow Drive, and see what she could see. Tonight, Candy would stay indoors with her again, a complete reversal of Jeanette's earlier decision, because tomorrow she would be returning home. She was such a lovely little dog, and Jeanette knew she would miss her. But by the end of the day, Jeanette hoped to have her own, an animal who would grow to love her and to feel loved in return. Animals were trustworthy. They didn't rape and molest without warning. She pulled the sketch pad towards her and opened it at the partly completed drawing she had created during the long hours of the night. She wrote the date of the attack in the bottom left corner, then paper-clipped the newspaper cutting to the top right corner, before sharpening her pencil to begin shading the table. It almost fully concealed the image of her own head, and most of his head. It had been hard to draw her own naked body, but the exercise would have been pointless if she hadn't gone for complete accuracy. She could only see her right breast, but it required the addition of the bite mark, so she carefully drew it, as near as she could get it to the exact spot. The picture was a depiction of the moment of rape, not the aftermath. Because of that, the only thing she hadn't added was the cobbler's foot. Chapter 5. Candy had been collected just after 10, negating any chances of an early morning trip to Meadow Drive. So Jeanette rang the dog rescue centre. She chatted with the woman in charge for a while, then asked what dogs they had in requiring rehoming. "We have 5, Chloe Danvers said. 2 of them need to be in a home without children because neither of them have ever known children and they're getting on a bit. The other 3 we decide when we knew who wanted them. You're looking for one to live with you?" "I am. There are no children here, so I want a medium-sized dog. Doesn't have to be a breed. I'm quite happy to take a scruff, provided we like each other." Jeanette heard Chloe laugh. "Then you're going to love Billy. He's definitely a scruff to look at, but all of us will be sad to see him go. Lovely attitude. He's lived for the past 8 years, since he was a tiny puppy, with his previous owner, who passed away a couple of weeks ago. He went to live with the daughter, but she has 3 kids and they wouldn't leave him alone, so she's asked us if we can rehome him. Jump in the car and come and have a look at him." Jeanette could see Billy had terrier in him, but what the rest was, she couldn't even begin to guess. She played with him for a while in his cage, then took him for a walk around the yard. He walked to heel impeccably, and she knew his previous owner had given the dog the time and training he needed. Jeanette went to find Chloe and took out her purse. "Can I take him today?" "You can. He's vet-checked, fully vaccinated and good to go." "So, how much do I owe?" Chloe smiled at her. "How much do I pay you if you have to take any overflow from us?" "I don't ask for anything." "Then Billy is our payment. Enjoy him, Janette, but you'll be breaking a few hearts here, I can tell you. Proper charmer he is." Billy explored the house, and she collected a clean dog bed from the storage cupboard in the spare room. She placed it at the foot of her bed. "This is where you'll sleep at night," she explained, and the dog tilted his head to one side, listening carefully. He must have liked what he heard, because he stepped onto the bed and curled up. "Good boy," she said, and knelt down to stroke his head. "Come on, let's go find out if you like the food I have in." He followed her obediently downstairs, and her face held a genuine smile for the first time in a couple of days. She headed for the kitchen, but Billy only followed as far as the curtain in front of the cellar door. He sniffed, moved the curtain slightly, then sniffed at the bottom edge of the door. "Come on," she said, feeling slightly panicked. She had thought earlier there was a strange smell, but decided to ignore it. She could do nothing about it except spray air fresheners everywhere. She filled a stainless steel bowl with food and the plastic bowl with water. Billy helped himself, having forgotten all about the odd smell for the time being. She watched as he tucked into his evening meal and smiled. He clearly enjoyed the taste and seemed to like her. Tomorrow they would go out. She had no clients due for almost a week, and Jeanette intended to bond with Billy over the next few days until she had to share herself with her guest dogs. She opened the fridge and stared in. Nothing she had in there appealed to her, and she decided to have something simple. Her stomach warned her it didn't really want anything, but she couldn't keep refusing food. At some point, life had to return to what she thought of as normal, pre-Philip Hancock. Jeanette lifted her small radio down from the windowsill and tuned it into the local radio station, guessing that if the police had anything to report, it would be on the station's next news bulletin. She was right. They led with the story of the missing man, appealing for information from the public. Nothing in his car gave them any inkling of where he might be, and they were getting increasingly concerned about his whereabouts. It had been a minor argument with his wife, nothing that would cause him to disappear altogether, and it was feared he might have met with an accident.